Hello and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we examine the region's biggest stories with the leaders shaping them. I am Katie Jensen. On this episode, we speak with Daniel Benaim, Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow at the Middle East Institute and former senior advisor in the Biden administration. Nearly 3 months into the conflict involving Iran, Israel and the United States, many across the Gulf are questioning whether Washington truly understood the risks this war could bring to the region and whether America still sees Gulf security as a priority. So has this conflict fundamentally changed the relationship between the Gulf and the United States? And as divisions over Israel deepen in Washington, are Gulf allies beginning to rethink their reliance on the US? Well, Mr. Benaim, thank you very much for joining us today on Frankly Speaking. Now, last week you co-wrote a Time magazine article titled "Why America Can't Walk Away from the Gulf Economies." And then we saw just days later, President Trump said he had delayed further strikes on Iran after advice from Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Qatar. Frankly speaking, has the Trump administration now reached the same conclusion you argued in that article, that America can no longer treat Gulf security as optional?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I think that statement reflects President Trump's attempt to do two things. First, I don't think he wants to go back to war. I think he understands that as much as he is stuck in this limbo between war and peace, trying to achieve the political aims of his war, more military strikes won't accomplish it. He also knows that Gulf states have given him a lot of good advice that he hasn't taken over the last 3 months, I think. And by naming the Gulf states, it gives him a fig leaf to pull back from military strikes that he doesn't really want. He wants to use these strikes to threaten Iran to get diplomacy moving, but he doesn't want to actually do the strikes. And it's a way to show, I think, to Gulf leaders that he respects them and that he's listening, even if, in fact, I think he could have probably done a lot more listening over the last 3 months.
And I think that's one of the big issues. It's obviously such a complicated moment for the Gulf right now, isn't it? We've seen many Gulf states obviously wanted to see Iran weakened, but the war has also come at a huge cost to the region, economically, politically and psychologically, as well as the rest of the world. Now, I know you've just returned from a regional tour. Tell me, were Gulf officials, what were they telling you privately behind closed doors?
Well, I think some of these private conversations I will probably have to keep private. But my sense is that across the region, there's a feeling that, on the one hand, the U.S. Brought the region and the Gulf into this war, which it wasn't seeking out. On the other hand, the U.S. showed up as the defense partner of choice, so that even though deterrence failed, defense largely succeeded in protecting Gulf cities and capitals and infrastructure from Iranian attacks. What I think you're seeing, though, is a sense of apprehension that the United States doesn't necessarily have a plan to take us from here to a kind of more sustainable security. So you're seeing individual Gulf states, I think, reach their own different conclusions. I don't get the sense that there's a unified Gulf perspective on what comes next, but you see a country like Saudi Arabia kind of leaning into the idea of a regional détente, of dialogue with Iran and finding a way to lower the temperature, and a country next door, like the United Arab Emirates, that I think is doubling down on the idea of hard power and partnerships outside the Gulf, because they've been hit so terribly hard by the Iranians over these last 3 months.
And obviously we've seen comments from people like former Saudi intelligence chief Prince Turki Al Faisal. He told CNN's Christiana Manpour at the very start of the war that, respectfully, he said he was surprised, President Trump appeared surprised that Iran would actually attack the Gulf countries. Now, obviously we have seen multiple attacks from Iran towards the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia's Aramco site several years ago, back in 2019. We've seen Iran target ADNOC in not too far from Abu Dhabi as well. Now, you are a former US administration official. You were an important advisor to President Biden during his time. Tell me, do you think Washington genuinely underestimated that risk, or was it that they deliberately ignored it?
You know, it's a great question. My sense is that when officials in Washington, in the military and the intelligence community, wargame what potential strikes with Iran would be like, two of the first things that they consider is the possibility of military retaliation into the Gulf and the possible closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So I think these are basics for the professional expert community. I think what you might be seeing is a bit of a gap between the political leadership, which maybe didn't factor these things in adequately, and the expert community. And I know that's immensely frustrating for the people who are downstream from these consequences. But I think part of what happened is that President Trump, as they say, got hungry from eating. He had success in changing the leader of Venezuela in an operation that many warned would go wrong, and in fact did change the leader of the country and set the country on a bit of a different course. He had tactical success, I would say, in setting back the Iran nuclear program last year in limited strikes last June. But I think he may have misread these calculated risks to assume that he was the difference between the warnings of his advisors not coming true and the success of these missions. I think he misread Iran, which was very restrained after last June, firing a salvo into Doha, but not launching a scorched earth campaign. He misread the idea that if he started a more existential war rather than a more limited war, that Iran would have no additional cards to play and would be restrained like it was last June. So I think it was really a miscalculation of political leadership, and a damaging one at that, not a failure of U.S. intelligence, which would have anticipated that this was a possibility. Lastly, I would say the fact that Iran so quickly went to the Gulf was a bit of a surprise to many analysts who knew it could happen, but not everyone was quite so certain it would happen within hours of the start of the war. Although Iran had threatened that, and we needed to be ready, and we were ready militarily, that I think was something that legitimately caught some people off guard.
I mean, I will say you're being quite restrained there, saying they underestimated. You mean specifically Donald Trump? And when we talk about, underestimating a situation, it's had huge consequences. The UN has estimated this war could cost Arab economies 120 billion, 194 billion through economic disruption, energy shocks, reduced growth. We've obviously seen oil prices skyrocket. It's cost the US a lot too as well. The Pentagon said it's cost them around $29 billion. Analysts say that's much more. So I think to say that, that they or President Trump underestimated it, frankly, for most of us based in the Gulf, bearing witness to this huge instability is frankly not good enough.
Well, I'm certainly not a spokesman for the Trump administration. I served under President Biden and President Obama. I think this war was a serious mistake and a misjudgment, and have said so publicly in my own country. And I think that I can understand why citizens in Gulf states would be enormously frustrated by that. I think also President Trump a year ago, it was little remarked, but we recently had the one-year anniversary last week of President Trump's own trip to the Gulf, showcasing the economies of this region and our economic partnership, all of which I think was set back by this war of choice. So I do believe that this was a costly mistake. I do also think, however, that the U.S. Gulf partnerships can and must survive this war and come out stronger to focus not only on security and defense and regional diplomacy, but on the very economic issues that we began upgrading our relationships to address 1 year ago. We shouldn't lose track of any of that. So I do think this was a mistake. I do think that it will do damage to U.S. standing over time. But I do also think that the United States and the Gulf states continue to need each other and to work better together than apart.
Absolutely, and obviously we're still seeing huge collaboration when it comes to AI, technology from both sides as well, and I want to ask you about that a bit later. But going back to what we were talking about, specifically the US-Iran-Israel war at the moment and the Gulf's reaction, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Do you think that the Gulf restraint and rather limited retaliation, do you think that ultimately that was the right response? As I mentioned, Gulf states obviously absorbed enormous consequences from this conflict without retaliating directly. Do you think that Washington fully understood the limits of that patience now? And frankly, that without stronger guarantees, can America realistically keep asking its closest allies to carry those risks?
Well, I think that exactly what the United States asks its Gulf country partners to carry will be a source of dialogue, maybe at times a source of tension, and something that we're going to have to work closely on together. The good news is that I think that Gulf leaders and this White House are in near constant contact even now about these issues. But there is a risk. And look, the fact is, Gulf states faced a serious dilemma from this war for which there are no good answers. In my view, the paradigm before February 28th, the idea of diversification beyond oil, of opening of public space, of interconnection to the global economy and the regional economy, of détente with Iran, and of deterrence from the United States, that was the plan. All of those legs of the stool faced some degree of shakiness over this past period. But I still think that by and large, that's the right plan. Détente with Iran, I think, will have to be adapted for a different Iran. And we'll see what's possible in terms of containment, deterrence, détente. But otherwise, this idea of diversification, connection to the world, opening up of space and U.S. partnership, I still think that that is the best of all the available models for the Gulf states to advance their own economies and to build dynamic societies. I think this war certainly set that back, but I still think that that's the right approach. As to whether they should strike Iran, engage in détente, etc., there are simply no good options, and I can understand the different perspectives. Every Gulf state, one way or another, is going to have to figure out how to make sure that their exports reach the global economy, figure out some kind of a modus vivendi over time next to Iran, work with regional powers and the United States that are pushing back against Iran, try to band together in various ways to create economic coordination and security coordination despite real political tensions within the Gulf right now. So there are no good options from where we are, and I think every Gulf leader is thinking about how to hold on to as much of their affirmative agenda as they can while planning for this much more complicated moment.
And I think there's certainly been a feeling in this part of the world there's been such a fundamental misunderstanding of the Iranian regime, who frankly have been preparing something like this for decades. But I want to pick up on something you just said earlier about the Strait of Hormuz, because in your Time article, you argue that reopening the strait is not an act of American generosity, but an economic necessity for the United States itself, as well as the rest of the world, really. Now, Gulf states have made clear they want the strait reopened fully and unconditionally, exactly as it was before the war. Realistically, how does that happen from here?
You know, in that article, which I wrote with Elisa Catalano from the Council on Foreign Relations in Time magazine, we also say that opening Hormuz is a pass-fail test for American leadership. This is part of our commitment to free and open global commerce and open sea lanes that goes back 80 years. So this is something, and certainly back to the Carter Doctrine in this region. It's incredibly important as a test for our leadership. It is not a good reflection on U.S. leadership when you have economies in South Asia that can only open 4 days a week because of disrupted energy supplies, and when it's harder to afford a mortgage in the United States, and allies from Asia to Europe are struggling, and Gulf countries and Gulf economies in some cases are really underwater, in the case of Kuwait and Qatar, without that egress, and very reliant on new Plan Bs for land-based shipping and other things. So we really need to deal with this. The idea that because America is not consuming imported oil through the strait that we can afford to walk away, I think is a dangerous delusion, not least because our partnerships with the Gulf and guarantees over this area are part of what underpins the petrodollar. So when you put all of this together,
Absolutely.
It's clear that the United States has a serious, vital national interest in achieving that. When it comes to how to actually do it, I think that Iran is going to need money. They're going to look for deterrence, and they're going to want to save face. Now, all of that requires concessions by the United States. If you want to create an alternative source of revenue, perhaps you can reach a large nuclear agreement that includes sanctions relief and access to frozen funds in exchange for addressing the loose nuclear material and the ongoing enrichment challenge and reopening the strait. That would solve Iran's revenue challenge. Iran would maintain the right in some ways, or the ability, let's say, and capability to disrupt transit through the strait. Unfortunately, they've shown what they can do, and it's very hard to unring that bell now that the world has seen that they have that capacity. You can't really remove the capacity, you can only remove the conduct. So I do think that there's a big deal to be had that reopens the strait, but I'm not at all confident that the two sides are ready to do it. Right now, in my view, they're both holding their breath to see if the other one will pass out first, applying economic pressure on the other party. And I think they both may think that they're still winning. So we may be in for a situation of choppiness, of instability, rather than either a return to war or an immediate diplomatic breakthrough. I'm hoping that the talks progress and we get to a breakthrough, but it's not at all guaranteed. You have two very different styles of negotiation colliding in Islamabad as we speak.
Absolutely, and as you kind of allude to there, I think this has simply shown just how easy it is for Iran to be able to disrupt the global economy. When we're looking at oil prices suddenly move from $60 to $100, that has huge ramifications for the entire world. I think IMF has called it the biggest energy shock of all time. But I want to ask as well, within the Time article, I thought you made another interesting point, because the Gulf has obviously been able to offer an alternative vision for the region. And it's been one very much focused on growth, investment and stability rather than revolutionary ideology that we've often seen in Iran. But there are analysts who are now argue this war has exposed vulnerabilities in that economic model itself. We've certainly seen a lot of the international press pick up on that as well. And it's been a different experience to be based here. But I'd be interested to understand, what's your thoughts on that?
Look, it's clear that this has in some ways been a setback for, if not the individual Gulf economies, some of which made money, some of which lost money, for the Gulf as a whole, as an idea of economic modernization and a destination for global business and investment. It put a cloud of risk over that I think was quite damaging. However, I would not bet against the determination of Gulf leaders, of their citizenry, the attractiveness of what the Gulf has to offer in terms of cheap energy, available capital, land, and a kind of top-down approach to welcoming business that is improving all the time, and I think already quite formidable and compelling. So I think in the medium term, you're going to see Gulf economies find ways to get creative and to bounce back. Elisa and I, in that article, we say that if Gulf economic modernization before February was a race car, I think in the period ahead it may be something more like an armored car or an SUV, sacrificing a little bit of speed for safety but still getting to the same destination. You're going to need redundant infrastructure, new pipelines to reduce dependency on the Strait of Hormuz. You're going to need railways, roads, other maritime routes through the Levant. You're going to need hardened data centers. All of these things will slow down a bit. Some investors will be scared away. Others may be attracted to engage in this kind of effort. I think you're going to need almost a Manhattan Project paced effort to make sure that air defenses in this region, layered air defenses against missiles and drones, move fast and move creatively. That creates some real opportunities to expand the U.S. and allied defense industrial base, to leapfrog and create the next generation of air defenses together, to work with U.S. partners like Ukraine, Israel, and Turkey and others to make sure that the Gulf states have every tool that they can use from a network of close partners to defend against the Iranian techniques that we've seen. This is the future of warfare, and the Gulf can help America and the world, frankly, develop the defensive tools that will be helpful against countries like Russia and Iran that seem determined to use these tools aggressively, and the Hashd-e-Shaabi in Iraq and elsewhere. So we need to work together on this, and frankly, we have all the motivation in the world to do it. So I see tremendous opportunities here for all the frustration and discouragement and soul-searching about this war and the ways that it changed everybody's plans, and I think changed those plans ill-advisedly from the start. I think there's still a tremendous amount that the U.S. and the Gulf can, should, and must do together when we look ahead.
And that's the thing, I think it's certainly a two-way street. We saw incredible investment from the US into the Gulf as well. We saw big partnerships such as between Microsoft and G42, about $1.5 billion there. We also saw Microsoft President Brad Smith, who joined G42's board as part of the deal that they had as well. We've seen the US give permission for NVIDIA advanced chips to be exported to the UAE, and big investments in Saudi Arabia. Aramco signing 34 deals with companies, during President Trump's Gulf visit last year, and a lot of money going back into the US as well. We've seen UAE in energy investments in the US, according to Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, who of course heads up ADNOC. That's potentially going to grow from $70 billion to $440 billion over the next decade. So certainly huge investment on both sides. But I wanted to ask a little bit further as well. When we look at some of these attacks, particularly there was one recently in the UAE on the weekend targeting the Baraka nuclear facilities. We've now seen more reports, and what we've seen on the weekend, that a lot of these attacks are also originating from Iraq. Now, I know you have expertise in counter-terrorism. Tell me, how would you assess the threat coming from pro-Tehran militia in Iraq? Is it able to be contained, or do you feel the worst is potentially yet to come?
Well, this is a really grave and serious matter. Attacking a nuclear facility should be way, way over the line, and an absolute red line, as the UAE said and the US has said. I think a few things need to happen here. Now, the Iranians will say, well, it was a symbolic attack and a threat. Regardless, stay away from nuclear sites. It's just totally unacceptable. When it comes to attacks from Iraqi militias, a few things need to happen. Number one, Gulf states, the United States, and a range of countries need to go to the new Iraqi Prime Minister, Ali Zaidi, and make clear to him that he needs to assert control over his territory and make sure that these militias cannot use Iraqi territory for attacks, and that if they do, they should expect that they will be retaliated against on Iraqi territory in response to defend against these attacks against the Gulf. The second thing that needs to happen is Iran needs to understand that attacks from Iraq will be treated as attacks from Iran, in the sense that this is a violation of the ceasefire. Nobody is buying the deniability that Iraqi militias are acting alone without coordination with the Iranian government. The Iranian government needs to tell them to stand down if they want to hold on to their ceasefire. So I do think that clear messages need to be sent in all directions, and where messaging fails, force will be needed to address this issue, because these militias are a threat to Iraqis. They're a threat to the United States. We want Iraq to be able to maintain its own stability and find its own solutions, but when forces inside Iraq are threatening countries in the region and threatening the United States, then that's going to damage the stability of Iraq, unfortunately, and the sovereignty of Iraq.
Oh, absolutely. The UAE's called it a real red line. We've seen it slammed by the IAEA. We've seen the United Nations come out as well. So again, huge condemnation, I think, not only from this part of the world, but internationally. I think even if we do see that pressure on the Iraqi government, I have to wonder, as you write about so elegantly in your article, it feels like a real psychological barrier has now been broken in the region. As you mentioned, oil facilities can be repaired, airports can reopen, but confidence is much harder to restore. And yet, despite that, you still seem quite optimistic about the Gulf's recovery. So what does recovery realistically look like from here? And how long could it take for investor confidence and a sense of stability to fully return?
Well, I think you're already seeing U.S. businesses that are really eager to get back to work in this region. They see the value of this region, the long-term value. They want to partner with the leadership. They appreciate the pragmatism and vision of a lot of the individual leaders. They want their capital. They want their partnership. They want to be here working to the rest of the Gulf. And frankly, they see the resilience in the face of these attacks. Country by country, everybody, I think, has performed remarkably. Whether it's the Bahrainis sending Gulf Air flights through Dammam with the Saudis kind of acting as almost like a lymphatic system for the rest of the Gulf, becoming kind of the geographic depth as countries begin trucking and using the Red Sea instead of the Strait, to the UAE going through Fujairah and Oman exporting to the Indian Ocean. everybody, I think, has shown real resilience, and I think that corporate America recognizes that. They can be very safety conscious, and I know that Gulf states will be watching closely who stayed, who went, and making decisions in the future based on that in terms of the value of their partnerships. This is something where both sides stand to benefit enormously, and I think that as soon as security conditions warrant, you could see a lot of U.S. companies back. And I think, frankly, you have seen already some leaders are beginning to come back and do that. I suspect you'll see more. So I believe that the fundamentals point to resilience, but the fact is we have a very dangerous and somewhat uncertain security situation at the moment, and it really is urgent that the United States, the Gulf states, the other mediators work with Iran to restore economic stability as quickly as we responsibly can. I think those talks are underway. They're difficult. But as long as those ingredients fall into place, I do think there will be a lot more bounce back and resilience. Some of the hopes to compete globally against East Asia as a destination, it's a little bit harder when you have this kind of risk in the profile. And that will be a cost and a damage of this war going forward. But I can't help but be optimistic that Gulf states have what it takes to engage in that economic modernization that they've begun, even if it looks slightly different, a little more securitized, a little more realist than it might have before. And frankly, in some cases, there were investments that had begun that were already being written down and delayed before this war. And this war may create, in some cases, an opportunity to really continue that work of ruthlessly focusing in on the projects and sectors that are going to be most helpful to the Gulf states. I certainly heard that and saw that in Saudi Arabia. That refocusing started in January and last year before this war. And I think the war will probably accelerate that trend from the Sovereign Wealth Fund and others to continue to focus and to transition from a period when sectors were kind of being watered and growing from the ground into one where they have to stand on their own and show that they're competitive and can compete and win in the sectors that have been developed under the first decade of 2030.
And I think you're absolutely spot on. I would say you can see the roads are busy, the shopping malls are busy, people are back in the office. They want to do business. We're starting to see events take off again. And I think the reaction for most of us based in this part of the world, the safety is one thing. I think it's the business confidence and bringing that back to life is another. And it does show still how quickly things can change. But we touched on it a little bit earlier. You were saying big focus needs to be on diplomacy. But tell me, how do you see this war ending? Do you have a particular timeline in mind?
So much of this lies in the very mercurial mind of Donald Trump and his willingness to make concessions, and in a set of Iranians who are less cohesive and less well known after the decapitation of the first rung of Iranian leadership. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty on both sides about the time frame here. I think there is a big diplomatic solution. There's also a culture clash. On the one hand, you have real estate developers who are very used to quick transactions, pressure moves, high leverage, and trying to get something done or just walk away, who don't really envision themselves camped out for months and months in a long negotiation. I think of the U.S. side as kind of fast food eaters and the Iranian side as engaged in a kind of more traditional slow cooking. In Iran, you could take an hour and a half to cook white rice, and it might be the best white rice in the world, but that's not the culture and pace and tempo of the Trump administration's businessmen negotiators. So that puts a lot of effort on the mediators who will have to do even more to bridge the gaps, to bridge the understandings of the two sides, to bridge the time frames, and try to create viable proposals for an impatient U.S. side and a maybe too patient Iranian side to come together and achieve an outcome. I still think that the likely outcome in the near term is a kind of unstable uncertainty between war and peace, where the two sides apply pressure on each other, engage in limited escalation and de-escalation, and that's kind of a risky place to be. It's very possible you could have a return to war. I don't think it will accomplish much beyond further damaging Gulf infrastructure and damaging in Iran that is unlikely to capitulate in the face of additional military pressure, but it's certainly possible. I think over time, I hope that we're headed toward the kind of diplomatic deal that we could have. but it may take some more time for both sides to realize that they're not in fact winning this war, and that the best path forward for everybody, including the region, is to come to some kind of negotiated solution. Now, a negotiated solution means a little bit of pain for everybody. For the United States, it means recognizing that we couldn't convince Iran to capitulate and we had to make real concessions on difficult issues. For the region, it probably means that missiles and proxies are dealt with outside of the four corners of an agreement like this. Maybe through some kind of additional regional diplomacy, maybe not. And for Iran, I think it means agreeing to deal making that requires real concessions, serious concessions on the nuclear deal, letting go of their power over the Strait of Hormuz, and also, frankly, working with the people who killed the supreme leader and who were part of this military campaign that has ravaged Iran without getting financial reparations or an apology or whatever maximalist request they have. So nobody is going to enjoy it, but I think it's better than the alternatives, and that's why I continue to hope that all sides are able to take that psychological and strategic journey from maximalist attempts to impose victory on the other side to something that has a little bit of something for everybody and leaves the region in a better place to move forward.
And I think that's still definitely a concern, but we're running out of time, so I want to move on to Israel. I'd be really interested to get your thoughts. Do you believe reports that we've seen from the New York Times suggesting that Prime Minister Netanyahu was the person who effectively sold or oversold this war to President Trump?
You know, I've seen those reports, and I do think that it sure seems like Prime Minister Netanyahu was one of the key advocates alongside many U.S. figures, including in President Trump's administration and Lindsey Graham, for this war. What's more interesting to me is why the U.S. president decided to launch it. You know, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been advocating for a war with Iran during the Obama administration, the George W. Bush administration, the Trump 1 administration, the Biden administration, and now Trump 2. I think really there's a narrative that Prime Minister Netanyahu is the architect of this war, and I don't see it that way. I think that President Trump, like all presidents before him, had to make a decision for what the most powerful country in the world should do on matters of war and peace, and he chose this. And I think he chose it in part because he was intoxicated by previous military successes in Venezuela and Iran, and felt that he could gamble and try to pull off regime change here. That's certainly what it looks like. Now, Israel had an important role. They showed that they have a formidable military and a formidable intelligence apparatus, both last year and then in the 40 days of war this year. But the problem for Israel and the United States is that the destructive power, the awesome destructive power of the Air Force, combined with intelligence operations and other tools, is enough to seriously hobble an enemy, but it's not enough to create a new political reality. It's enough to damage a militia group, but it's not enough to leave stability in its wake. And I think that is going to be a problem that we'll be dealing with across the Middle East after Israel made important, in some cases extremely important, tactical successes against Hezbollah in weakening the Assad regime before it fell, and pulling Iran back from the nuclear threshold. These all contributed, I think, to regional security. But the question remains, how do we get from these military successes to something that provides security not only for Israelis, but for the rest of the region, which ultimately is the only way that Israel will really be secure.
So you feel he essentially underestimated or ignored the major risks. It's something we've been talking about a lot on this program, because I recently interviewed former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert last week. Now, he strongly criticized Mr. Netanyahu's government. He argued its policies are increasingly backfiring against Israel itself and, frankly, damaging its standing internationally. Tell me, what are your thoughts of Mr. Netanyahu's strategy on Iran and beyond?
You know, I think Israel after October 7th faced a national trauma and a kind of nearly an existential threat. They lost territory, they lost 1,000 people, 250 people were taken, and in some ways it spoke to the worst traumas of Israel to see those kinds of kidnappings and pogroms, historic traumas. I think it was very important to beat back Hamas and to go after Iran and some of the extremist networks that attacked Israel after that. And I think they did have important tactical successes that had strategic implications in places like Lebanon and Syria, and in pulling Iran back from the nuclear threshold. Unfortunately, I think what hasn't happened and what needs to happen is finding a way to pivot from military action quickly into peace building, stability building, diplomacy, conflict resolution. These are the things that will allow Israel to have a kind of security that is shared beyond its borders, so that other countries look at Israel as a place that is providing security not only for its own citizens, but also for the entire region. I think there were opportunities that were missed to do just that over these last 3 years. And I think there's an ongoing missed opportunity to take the awesome military might of Israel and its ability to push back on militias and militant actors and states that threaten the entire region in a way that enhances regional security. So far, I think they've done a much better job of knocking down their opponents and threats than they have of building any kind of durable peace or stability in the wake of that. And I'm hopeful that the next chapter of Israeli foreign policy will pay more attention to that than the last one has, which I think has been an unfortunate mistake.
But I think we're also seeing really that criticism is increasingly extending beyond Mr. Netanyahu himself to some of the more hardline figures in his government. There's been that shocking video this week from Israeli Minister Ben-Gvir. He's faced international backlash over that flotilla video, showing him taunting pro-Palestinian activists detained from the Gaza flotilla. Now, many officials worldwide have slammed the video. Even US Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, publicly condemned the behaviour, calling it despicable. What do you make of that incident, and does it reflect growing discomfort in Washington over some figures within Mr. Netanyahu's government?
Yeah, well, first of all, look, I was glad to see that even the Trump administration and Ambassador Huckabee came out and really rightfully, strongly condemned this incident, which showed a face of Israel to the world that I think was not one that the world found palatable or attractive. And that's frankly what Prime Minister Netanyahu himself said when he condemned this video. Look, I think it speaks to a current of kind of hyper-nationalism, extremism, exclusivism within the Israeli political structure and spectrum that these ministers are expressing. And I think that it is not a particularly good path for Israel or for the U.S.-Israel relationship to go down that road of kind of hyper-aggression. Israel faces real threats and real challenges and has every right to advocate for itself and defend itself. But I think that this kind of self-defense and this kind of self-advocacy does a lot more harm than good. And it doesn't paint a picture of Israel as a country that's going in a direction where anyone else would want to follow. And so I think that it contributes to a sense of diplomatic isolation there. So I personally was glad to see the wave of condemnation, and I hope that the Israeli government, besides these ministers, takes it to heart, and that Israel finds a way to deal with these currents within its society to be a much better participant in the larger region.
Oh, shocking video. Finally, final question for you today. I can't let you go without getting your thoughts on US politics. Now, obviously, November midterms coming up. Tell me, what are your predictions and how much will this war shape the outcome politically for President Trump and both parties?
You know, it's a very good question. One of the nice things about spending 4 years serving my country at the State Department and the White House is that I still believe in nonpartisan public service, and now I work at a nonpartisan think tank. So while I worked for President Biden and Obama, I come at it with a public servant's perspective. But what I will say is that this war, in some ways, challenged people's idea of President Trump, challenged American voters' idea of him as somebody who, while he was able to threaten war and act in a bellicose way to advance U.S. interests, ultimately knew how to pull back rather than getting entangled in complex, messy conflicts. And I think this war kind of undercut that impression, and it softened his support among some of his diehard supporters. Because of cultural reasons and interpersonal reasons, in our country, I think he has a base of support that still remains very strong. But to be honest, it's shrinking, and it's much less than half the country. And these kinds of events, these kinds of wars, even if the country wasn't laser focused on them to begin with, they tend to send a message about what kind of leader a person is that voters take very seriously. We saw President Biden's approval rating go down after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was not a major issue for American voters, but it did create an impression that was very hard to erase in the aftermath. And you might be seeing a version of the same thing here. Now, when it comes to the elections in November, the most important issues for Americans are economic issues, including prices. And this war does two things to address that. First, it raises the price of gas and oil and other inputs in the United States, and people know that. But second, it creates the impression that the president is focused on something besides the cost of living in the United States. And for some American voters who expected that he would be laser focused on the economy, that may be disappointing. We're very far away from the action here, and this is not the Iraq War when Americans were dying hundreds at a time and people were sending their neighbors' children off to war. That was a kind of moment that was an earthquake election 20 years ago when people opposed the Iraq War. I don't think we're dealing with that here. I think we're dealing with a much smaller effect. But in a very evenly divided country, a smaller effect can be enough to be decisive in the elections this November. And we'll have to just wait and see.
Let's hope we do see that. And of course, we've seen President Trump appear to joke this week about potentially becoming Israel's next prime minister, claiming he's got a claim. That's right. I'm just going to say thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Well, let's hope we do see more of that diplomacy. And of course, President Trump just this week appearing to joke about potentially becoming Israel's next prime minister, claims he has a 99% approval rating there. But Mr. Benaim, thank you so much for joining us today on Frankly Speaking. We do appreciate your time. Thank you.